Hi everyone, and welcome to another Simplicity Sewing tutorial. My name is Brittany J. Jones, and in today's video, we are going to be sewing 3D flower appliques. These 3D flowers are detachable, so you can make them and put them on an array of different projects. Let's get started. To make our flowers, we will be using the pattern pieces from Simplicity 3101. We will get started with the gathered lily, and you will need pattern piece number 10 and pattern piece number 11. In this tutorial, I will be using one of these. I'll be using the large flower, which is pattern piece number 10, but just know that the construction is the same for both. Go ahead and cut out your fabric pieces as well as interfacing pieces, and it's much easier to interface the entire flower pattern block as opposed to cutting them out individually. So as you can see here, I've gone ahead and interfaced the entire flower pattern block. Before cutting, I do recommend making a copy of your pattern block. That way your flowers and everything stay intact and it'll be much easier to cut for future projects. With the fabric pieces right sides facing, I'm just going to pin the pattern piece onto it like so, making it easier for everything to stay together as I begin cutting. I'm going to cut this out using my rotary cutter and my cutting mat, but you're more than welcome to use your scissors if you prefer to cut it out that way. Let's go ahead and cut everything out now and move on to the next step. Now that you have them all cut out, we're going to pin the petal sections together, again right sides facing, having the raw edges even. We're going to stitch them together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When we stitch, we will be leaving the short straight ends open. We will clip the curves, turn the petal right side out, and then press. But first, let's go ahead and pin around the petals. Stitch using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're going to leave the short straight edge open, then we will trim our seams and turn everything right side out and press. Let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Now that we have them all sewn, we can go ahead and trim away the loose threads and then start trimming down our seam allowance for all of the petals. I will be using my pinking shears to just trim around all of the petals, and then again I'm going to flip it right side out, give it a good press. Go ahead and do all of the other petals the same exact way, trim them, flip them right side out, and then give them a press. From just one of the flower pattern blocks, you are able to create 2 flowers, and you should assemble them as so. You will have 3 large petals, 3 medium petals, and 4 small petals. Taking each group, we are going to stitch them together at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the raw edge, and we're going to have the inner corners meeting. So let's go ahead and stitch that now. Here's a look at how my large petals are looking. Again, you do want to make sure that you have those inner corners touching. You can do that by machine, or you can hand tack them together along that inner corner so that they are touching. Do that for the medium and the small petal groups as well. Taking a needle and some strong thread, whatever heavy duty thread you have will be great. We're going to do long running stitches on the edge of the petal groups at a 1/4 inch. So right along that 1/4 inch stitching line, we're going to do some long running stitches, and you want the stitches to be about a 1/4 inch apart. So again, right along the 1/4 inch stitching line that we already made, go ahead and do some long running stitches and have the stitches about a 1/4 inch apart. Next, you're going to pull up on the thread to shape the flower. This is going to allow the petals to curl slightly inward. A slight base will form on the bottom. Once it has started to curl, then you just want to secure it in place by joining the first and the last petal together. So again, once you have pulled it to create that curl so that it starts to take shape, go ahead and secure it by attaching the end of the last petal to the end of the first petal like so. And then you can knot and secure your threads, and then repeat those same steps for the medium and small size petal group. Once you have all of the groups formed and secured, you're going to take the medium petal group and place it on top of the large petal group. You can rotate the petals so that the flower will look nice and full, and then taking a needle and thread, you just want to tack the underside of the medium petal near the center of the large petal. So again, just tacking the underside of the medium petal to the center of the large petal. And then you want to repeat that for the small one. You want to tack the underside of the small petal to the center of the medium petal. So go ahead and continue doing that for the small petal group as well. Once you have all of the petals secured, yours should look similar to this. One thing I do recommend is for the smaller one, you want to make sure that you really get it nice and tight. This right here is an example of one that I did, and you can see how you can see a lot of the threads along the inside petal. So just make sure that you really pull and secure the thread so that you have a nice center on the middle of your petal. Next, you want to go ahead and grab a bar pin, and then you would just secure this to the bottom base of the flower. So again, go ahead and secure your bar pin now on the bottom of the flower, and you are all done making your gathered lily. To make the gathered rose, we will be using Simplicity 3101. For pattern pieces, we will need pattern piece 12, 13, 14, and 15. For this tutorial, I will be using the small flower, which is pattern piece number 15, but do know that the construction is the same for the medium and the large flower. To begin, I'm going to start working on the base, and you should cut the base pattern piece out along the outer solid line. We're going to stitch a 1/4 of an inch away from the outer edges, and then we're going to do a 1/8 of an inch stitch from the raw edge using a basting stitch. Again, we're going to stitch a 1/4 of an inch from the outer edge, and then we're going to stitch an 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge using a basting stitch. Let's go ahead and do those stitches now. Now that we have it done, yours should look similar to this. Now we're going to turn in the raw edge along the 1/4 of an inch stitching line, and you want to pull on that gathering stitch to ease in the fullness. So as you can see here, I'm pulling on that gathering stitch, and now I'm just going to press along that 1/4 of an inch stitching line. Go ahead and knot your threads, give it a press, and then we can set this to the side to start to work on the rose. To make the roses, we're going to start in the center. We're going to fold the flower in half lengthwise, having wrong sides together. So the right side of the fabric should be out facing you. Make sure that you match up your notches and have the raw edges even. You will have to manipulate the ends to fit because it will be rounded and wavy, and that is normal. Again, you just want to manipulate the ends so that it fits. Go ahead and finish pinning, and do not press this after you have it pinned. Do not press that folded edge. Next, we can head to the machine, and we're going to gather the raw edge. We're going to machine stitch 3/8 of an inch from the raw edge, and then again 1/8 of an inch from the first stitching within the seam allowance. So first at a 3/8 of an inch, and then at 1/8 of an inch. Let's gather the fabric now. Now that we have the gathers sewn on, now we can go ahead and pull up on the gathers. Each of the flowers have a specific length that you need to gather it up to. For the small flower, it needs to be gathered to 15.5. For the medium flower, 16.5. And for the large flower, 22.5. Because I'm doing the small, I'm going to gather this up to 15.5, and then I'm going to secure and knot the ends of the gathers together. Next, starting at one end, we're going to start to roll the gathered edge of the rose, and we're going to be hand tacking it as we roll it together. So again, you just want to start on one end, rolling it together along the gathered edge, and you want to hand tack it as you roll. Once you have it all rolled up, you can go ahead and trim away your loose thread and secure your tack. I did do an additional rose just to kind of compare the sizing so you can kind of see the difference in the fullness. This one right here is the large, and I will show you what that looks like compared to the small. Next, you want to go ahead and grab your base, and you are going to slip stitch the press edge of the base over the raw edge of the underside of the rose. So again, take your base and you're going to slip stitch that over the underside of the rose. Once you have that slip stitched on, you can go ahead and sew on your bar pin on the underside of the flower. Once you have the bar pin secured, you are all done sewing your gathered rose. To make the fringe edge flower, I will be using Simplicity 3104 and using the detachable flower that's available with the pattern. We will be using pattern piece number 16 as well as pattern piece number 17, which is the base of the flower to make it. With your fabric wrong sides together, you want to go ahead and start to cut out your fabric pieces. So again, make sure that the wrong sides are together. The right side of the fabric should be out facing you. Go ahead and cut out your flower pieces now. I'm using scissors, but if you prefer, you can go ahead and use a rotary cutter and mat. I did apply some additional pins just to make sure all the layers stay together. Again, once you have everything cut out, make sure that your fabric is wrong sides facing and the right side is out facing you. Once you have them all cut out, you can go ahead and start pinning them together. We're going to baste the raw edges together as well as baste along the tuck lines. After you have it all basted, then we will stitch along the outer stitching line. So again, we're going to baste the raw edges together, baste along the tuck lines, and stitch on the outer stitching line. Okay, once you have it all stitched and basted, you will have a lot of loose threads. You can go ahead and clean those up. I am using a contrasting thread for the tutorial, so you'll be able to see, but you should definitely be using coordinating and matching thread to your fabric. So taking the two-sided petal, we are going to hand gather along the center stitching lines. So I just have a needle and thread, and again, I'm just going to hand gather along the two stitching lines on the center of the two-sided petal. Once you have them hand gathered, then you can pull tightly to gather them, and then you will create a knot. So again, on the two petal, go ahead and gather up along those center stitching lines, and then pull it tightly to gather it, and then secure it with a knot. And now that we have the two-sided petal gathered in the center, now we're going to start working on the three-sided petals. And we're going to fold the petals matching the solid tuck lines. So again, to make the tucks, you want to bring those stitching lines together, and we are going to stitch, back stitch at the beginning and at the end to secure the tucks on the center of the three-sided petals. Now that we have them stitched, yours should look similar to this. So now we're going to thread a needle with a strong thread. I'm going to be using my basting thread. We're going to knot the ends together, and we're going to stitch through the ends of the tucks at the center, pulling tightly so that we can gather the center. So again, taking a needle and thread, you just want to stitch through the ends of the tucks at the center and pull the thread up tightly so that you can gather the center of the petal. Once you have it gathered to your liking, then you can go ahead and knot it to secure the stitch. Once you have secured the center of the three-sided petal, yours should look similar to this. So now we can go ahead and start to fringe the edges of all the petals. I started out using a pen, but then I quickly moved over to using a pair of tweezers. These worked so much better at helping to pull the horizontal thread to create the fringe. So that's just a tip. If you're having a hard time creating the fringe, try a pair of tweezers. Once you have all of them fringed, I'm only going to do one here in the video, but just know that you need to fringe all the edges on all of the petals before we start to assemble them. To assemble the petals, you're going to have them all right sides facing up. You want to lap the two-sided petal over the large three-sided petal, making sure that you match up the centers. You can turn the petals however you prefer to kind of fill them in and fill in the gaps. But again, make sure that you have the two-sided petal on top of the three-sided petal, and go ahead and thread you a needle with some strong thread. I'm using my basting thread here, but you can use any type of heavy duty thread that you have. And starting from the back of the petal, you're going to come up through the center of both of the petals and then back down through the center. So start from the back, come up through the center, and go back down the center. Go ahead and knot the thread, but do not cut it. With your needle still prepped, go ahead and lap the smaller three-sided petal on top of the two-sided petal, and then come back up through the center and down through the center. Again, make sure that you move the petals around to your liking, and just continue to do that a couple times to secure them in place. Once you have them secured, you can go ahead and cut your thread, and this is what your petals should look like. Again, make sure that you're using coordinating thread and that you've already fringed the edges. The next thing that we want to do is we want to cut out the base, and you're going to fuse interfacing to one side of the base. And so with wrong sides together, again, the right side of the base should be out facing you. With wrong sides together, we're going to stitch close to the edge. You can do that by hand or by machine. I went ahead and did it by machine, so this is what mine look like here. And so now we can pin the base to the back of the flower over the center, and then you just want to hand sew in place around the edges. So again, once you have your base pieces prepped and ready, put it over the center of the back of the flower and just hand sew it along the edges to the base. Once you have it hand sewn on, the last thing for you to do is to go ahead and sew on a bar pin to the base. And again, because these are detachable and you can use them for any type of project, you may want to use a different type of pin on the back. But for the tutorial, I used a bar pin. Here's an example of what your finished fringe edge flower should look like. Again, you should have used coordinating thread and you should have also fringed all of the petals. Once you have finished sewing on the barre pin along the base, you are all done with your fringed edge flower. To make a detachable gathered rose in two sizes, we will be using Simplicity 3099 for this tutorial. For pattern pieces, we will be using pattern piece number 7, 8, and 9. I do recommend making a copy of these pattern pieces, that way they stay intact, especially pattern piece number 7. Be sure that you transfer all of the lines and markings on the pattern, all the stitching lines, all the placement lines, and make sure that you cut out the appropriate number of fabric pieces and interfacing pieces for the base. To cut out the flower, you want to have 2 of your fabric pieces right sides facing. Transfer your markings onto the wrong side of the fabric, and then once you lay your pattern piece back on top, you will cut along the solid line to cut only the part of the flower that we will need to create the rose. To cut, I am going to use my rotary cutter, but if you feel more comfortable with scissors, then you can definitely use those. Just make sure that you get nice clean cuts as you're cutting along the solid line. I also added some additional pins just to make sure all the layers stay together. Once you have it all cut out, you can discard the piece that says cut out, and this is how your flower should look. Next, you can go ahead and remove your pattern, and with your fabric pieces still right sides facing, make sure that you transfer those markings. With raw edges even, you can go ahead and pin along the outer edge of the flower, and then we are going to be stitching using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But first, go ahead and pin all the way around the outer edge of the flower like so. Once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch in a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now that we have it stitched, you can go ahead and grab your shears or your rotary cutter and mat if you prefer, and just trim down your seam a little bit like I'm doing here. Once you have it trimmed, go ahead and turn the flower right side out. You can give it a press, and then we're going to baste a 1/4 inch from the raw edge. So first, go ahead and turn it out, right sides out like I'm doing here, and then you can go ahead and give it a press, and then you will baste the inner raw edges together. Now that you have it basted, next we're going to go ahead and start to form the pleats. The pleats are at those small circles that we transferred. So what we're going to do is we're going to fold on the outer small dot, and we're going to bring that fold to the inner small dot. So again, you can see how I am working from the outer toward the inside. So again, starting at the outer small dot, you will fold there and then bring that fold to the inner small dot like so, and then just continue doing that for all of the other dots on the fabric. Now that you have all of the pleats pinned, we're going to be using a hand stitch, a long running stitch with heavy thread. For the thread, I'm just using some basting thread, but if you have another type of heavy thread, that would be fantastic to use. And we're just going to hand gather the lower edge right along the 1/4 inch seam line. So you're going to do a long running basting stitch along the 1/4 inch seam line that we already created, and then you're going to do another one at 1/8 inch from the seam line within the seam allowance. You can choose to do this by machine if you prefer to use your machine to gather. I made an additional flower and I basted that one by machine. So again, you can do machine or by hand. But right here, I'm just using a long running stitch with heavy thread, and I'm just going to hand gather the lower edge. One will be along the 1/4 inch seam line that we already basted, and then another will be at 1/8 inch seam line within the seam allowance to form the gathers. Okay, I have both rows of my gathers done. Now I'm going to put the flower to the side, and we're going to start to work on the base. Let's go ahead and grab our base pattern pieces now. For the base, you are going to interface the wrong side of one, and then with wrong sides together, then you are going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the raw edge, and then you can finish it off with a zigzag stitch or with an overlock serger machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin them together. Again, you should have interfaced one of the pieces, and you should have them wrong sides facing. So the right side of the fabric should be facing you. I'm going to go ahead and stitch this one now at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you have your bases sewn, they should look like this. Next, we want to go ahead and transfer all of the placement lines onto your base pieces. So I have transferred some little dots here, but I'm just going to go ahead and fill them in. Again, these are the placement lines. So we're going to be placing the flower on these lines to stitch them in place. So go ahead and transfer all of those markings from the base pattern piece onto the base fabric, and then we can start to pin the flower onto the base. To create the small flower, you should be using the small base, and we're going to use one of our flower pieces. Just start to pull up on those gathering threads to start to gather the flower, and then we're going to start placing the seam line, the 1/4 inch seam line, along the placement line on the base, and that's going to help us to create the flower. So just take your time and go ahead and create your gathers. I do recommend getting a nice even gather and distribute the fullness, and that's going to give you a really nice flower. So just take your time, gather everything up, and again, you're placing the seam line, 1/4 inch seam line, along the placement line on the base. This does take a little bit of maneuvering, so just be patient, and again, make sure that you have some really nice gathers. Once you have the small flower gathered up to your liking, you're going to repeat those same exact steps to do for the large flower, except for this one, you're going to be using 2 of pattern piece number 7, and you will start to pin the flower to the base. Again, you want to place that 1/4 inch seam line along the placement line, but you're going to start at the inner placement line for the large flower, and then just kind of start working your way out. I did it backwards here in this clip, but again, start on the inner placement lines and just work your way out on the large flower. Again, remember to just distribute the gathers evenly. Once you have both of your flowers to your liking, you can go ahead and baste them in place, and then you can stitch them, stitching along that placement line and seam line at a 1/4 inch. I do recommend stitching this by hand, that way you have more control, but if you would like to use the machine, you absolutely can. I made a few of these, but one thing that I found really helpful was to go ahead and secure the center of the flower. That way I had a nice, clean, and really pretty center. And once I had that secured, and as you can see, I just did a little straight stitch just to secure the center. Then I started going around the placement line and seam line, stitching it down at a 1/4 inch. But that's totally up to you, and it's optional. I just wanted to share with you all a tip that helped while I was creating the flowers. Let's go ahead and stitch them along the placement line now. Here is the small flower once it is all sewn and secure. Definitely make sure that you are using coordinating and matching thread to your fabric. And this is another reason why I recommend doing it by hand. You would get a much nicer circle along the placement line if you are sewing it by hand. But again, this is what it looks like along the back. This is what the small flower looks like. And I'm really happy with how the center looks. I'm going to show you an example of what a previous flower I created looked like. And you can see how the center didn't quite form that well, and it's a lot smaller too because the gathers, I didn't pull them up as much. So again, really pull up on those gathers and then really turn in that center to really form it so that you'll have a nice center of your flower. The last thing for us to do is to go ahead and sew on a bar pin. For the small flower, you will need 1 bar pin. For the large flower, you will need 2. Because these are detachable and you can put them on anything, you can choose to use a different type of pin in the back. Maybe you want to put it on a hair accessory, you can use a hair bow. But again, for this tutorial, we're using a bar pin. Go ahead and grab them and then hand sew them onto the center of the flower. Once you have your bar pin sewn on, you are all done making your detachable flowers. Well, that is all for the 3D flower applique video. I really do hope that you found it helpful. Again, you can do so much with these detachable 3D flower appliques, so go ahead and be creative. Until next time, blessings everyone. Bye.